Welcome to Anderson House, the Washington, D.C. headquarters of the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. My name is Plesslunger, and I'm President General of the Society, a position first occupied by General George Washington. He held his post from our founding in 1783 until his passing on December 14, 1799. Today is November 11th, 2019, which marks the 100th anniversary of Veterans Day in America. Originally known as Armistice Day and renamed in 1954, this is a day when we recognize the service of all U.S. military veterans. We are delighted to mark this important day with a special event designed to salute America's veterans. I'm especially pleased that our guests this evening include a fellow North Carolinian who is the nation's Secretary of Veteran Affairs, the Honorable Robert Wilkie. The Society of the Cincinnati was our country's first veterans group, so it's particularly fitting that the Secretary will be providing remarks. You will hear a little more about that in just a moment. We are gathered here tonight to listen to a distinguished panel of noted historians who will be discussing the experience of American veterans since the revolutionary generation more than 240 years ago. I also want to encourage you to return to Anderson House and visit us again and look at our very special museum exhibition, America's First Veterans. It's behind me and behind the fireplace, so you may not go in there now. The exhibit opened last week and it will go till the spring of 2020. I'm going to ask Mark Williams, Chairman of the Board of Overseers of the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, to provide, Mark, a very brief summary of who we are and what we do, and then to introduce our distinguished Secretary. Mark?
Thank you, Pless. The American Revolution was the world's single most important achievement, furthering self-governance in the past 1,000 years. In May of 1783, towards the end of that war, the Continental officers formed an organization with two primary purposes. First, they wished to perpetuate the remembrance of the American Revolution and the ideals for which they fought. Second, they wanted to perpetuate the mutual friendships which had been formed in the crucible of war. Of note, our organization's charter goes on to state that the spirit of friendship extends to providing care for one's fellow combatants and their families, the first such expression in our history. In considering a name for this organization, the officers were inspired by a famous Roman leader, Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, who twice voluntarily gave up his near absolute dictatorial authority to return to being a mere ordinary farmer. Hence, those Revolutionary War officers deemed an appropriate name for their organization to be the Society of the Cincinnati. Note that the military ceding authority back to civilians may seem obvious today, but in 1783, it was nothing short of an extraordinary. Nothing like that had ever happened before. Even afterwards, there are numerous examples of the military remaining in control after successful revolutions. Consider Napoleon, Lenin, Mao, Castro, and others. Membership in the society is limited to a few thousand men because eligibility requirements consist of being the eldest male descendant of a Continental officer, with only a single person being able to represent that officer. I'll come back to that. For the first 200 years of the Society's existence, most of our focus was on the fraternal purpose. Frankly, that's because there was not much need to focus on the mission purpose. as our nation's founding was more roundly celebrated throughout America than today. For example, school children routinely memorize the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They learned of the sacrifice made by ordinary folks to secure our independence, to establish our republic, to create our national identity, and to commit the new nation to ideals of liberty, equality, natural rights, civil rights, and responsible citizenship. Unfortunately, a couple generations ago, this sort of education started to become tarnished. Cincinnati leaders recognized that they'd have to start focusing more on the remembrance of that vast event, as our forebears called it, and its associated ideals. Furthermore, they recognized that their limited resources of only 3,500 domestic members would not be enough to accomplish their enormous, yet vitally important goals. As a result, the Society created the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. Here, eligibility is open to all who share our patriotic passion. As magnificent as the Revolutionary War achievements were, like in any human endeavor, the results of the war and the civilian government that followed were not perfect. Notably, it failed to resolve slavery, women's suffrage, and particularly poignant for tonight's discussion, it did not address veterans' rights. But lest we fall into the trap of presentism, the intellectual fallacy of judging the past by current standards, we must recognize that the revolution created an evolutionary process. That's the beauty of our heritage. While it did take us a couple of generations to grant Revolutionary War veterans a pension, the important fact is that we did so, and that we were the first nation in the world to do so. As Pless indicated, if you hadn't had an opportunity to visit our museum, I strongly encourage you to do so. Tonight, I'm delighted to introduce the Secretary of Veteran Affairs. Secretary Wilkie's background and list of accomplishments could take most of the evening, but please allow me to share a few. Perhaps first and foremost, he's the son of an Army officer and grew up at Fort Bragg. He's an attorney and currently a colonel in the Air Force Reserve. He has more than 20 years of federal service at the national and international level, including being an Assistant Secretary of Defense for Donald Rumsfeld, and later for Robert Gates, as well as a Senior Director at the National Security Council under Condoleezza Rice. Prior to that, he had extensive experience serving multiple congressmen. And outside of the federal, this isn't a one-badge army here, outside of the federal sector, he's been Vice President of Strategic Programs for a multi-billion-dollar public company focusing on large-scale engineering and program management. Academically, Secretary Wilkie holds degrees, an honors degree from Wake Forest, a JD from Loyola out of New Orleans, a Master of Law from Georgetown, a Master's in Strategic Studies from the Army War College. In addition, he has graduated from several military colleges. He has published articles in multiple military journals and has been awarded the highest non-civilian award of the Defense Department, the Defense Distinguished Public Service Medal. Please allow me to introduce you all to the Honorable Robert Leon Wilkie. And if I may take a line from Casablanca, I'm glad he's on our side now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Do you mind?
No, not at all.
The pin reads, the American Revolution Institute.
Thanks, sir. Thank you all very much. This is a wonderful ending to, for us at Veterans Affairs, this day of days, when we celebrate the 41 million Americans who have put on the uniform since the first shots were fired at Lexington Green in April of 1775. It is important for me also to echo what was just said, because it is an honor for me to be here amongst the keepers of the American flame, those who fight against presentism, who understand that people like the indispensable man over my shoulder are men embedded in their times and struggled, as all humans do, with how to make the best of what has been given to them. It was Winston Churchill who said, after a rather mixed academic career, that I let the smart children know Latin for a fashion and Greek for a treat, but I hit them hard when they don't know their history. And this place drips with history. This society was founded in Newburgh, New York, where one of the seminal events in the history of the United States Army, indeed the history of armies in the West, was born when certain officers, including one scoundrel named Gates, and I won't talk about him very much, were threatening to overthrow the order that that gentleman established. And in the midst of chaos stepped George Washington. He walked into the barn, and he started to speak, but he couldn't. So he pulled out a piece of paper and tried to read it, but he couldn't do that. And he reached for spectacles. And he said, "Forgive me, gentlemen, because I have grown almost blind, and my hair has grown white in the service of my country." The tears began to flow like rivers that night. And a few weeks later, he was in Fraunces Tavern in New York, saying goodbye to the Hamiltons, the Tillmans, Laurens, Light Horse Harry Lee, Henry Knox, the founder of this society, or the first president of this society, and others who had borne the cause of American freedom on their shoulders. And it is those ancestors that we honor most tonight. The process of turning the ideas of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence into something real required the most necessary ingredient in any fight: soldiers. And in those years, this fledgling nation got an early glimpse of the importance of the men and women who stand up to be counted. In January of 1776, Tom Paine, who helped inspire the reading of the Declaration of Independence across the Continental Army by publishing, of course, Common Sense. Things, as you know, were not going very well that winter. British troops had pushed Washington out of New York, New Jersey, and into Pennsylvania. That prompted Paine, who was retreating with the Continental Army, with what was left of Washington's dissolving army, to write the first American crisis essay that December. You know the first line. These are the times that try men's souls. But what followed was a lesser-known appeal to the spirit of America's warriors. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny. Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. A few days later, as you know, Washington crossed the Delaware and routed the Hessian mercenaries under Johann Rall on that Christmas day, a brilliant stroke that would infuse the American cause for years to come. America owes everything to those men and women who refuse to be known as the summer soldiers or the sunshine patriots. All through our history, as we have spoken of national unity, the real obstacle to moving forward the boundaries of freedom and the only danger to America comes from within. That is not a new thought. Ronald Reagan spoke of it often. In fact, if you look at Reagan's thoughts on the American Revolution, they are infused with his observations of the relationship between two of the great masters of the Revolution, Mr. Adams and Mr. Jefferson. Once independence was gained and a government was formed, partisanship ripped the bonds of friendship that these two men had formed, first in 1775. Thomas Jefferson destroyed John Adams in 1800. The night before Jefferson's inauguration, Adams slipped out of Washington, embittered, sorrowful, and brokenhearted. But when both had retired, Jefferson to Monticello and Adams to Peacefield and Quincy, they began through their letters to speak once again. As Reagan reminded us in 1986, they wrote on every imaginable subject: gardening, horseback riding. Jefferson even talked about sneezing as a cure for hiccups. But other subjects were there: the loss of loved ones, like Abigail and Charles Adams, the mystery of grief and sorrow, the importance of religion in the young country, and of course, the last thoughts, the final hopes of two old men, two great patriarchs for the country that they had helped to found and loved so deeply. It carries me back, Jefferson said, to the times when, beset with difficulties and dangers, we were fellow laborers in the same cause, struggling for what is most valuable to man, his right to self-government, laboring always at the same oar with some wave ever ahead threatening to overwhelm us, and yet, passing harmless by, we rode through the storm with heart in hand. That was their last gift to us, the lesson in brotherhood, in tolerance for each other, insight that would make America strong and great as a nation. And when both died on the same day within hours, July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the Declaration was signed, America had what many considered to be a divine sign. I mentioned earlier, 41 million Americans have worn this nation's uniform since the first volunteers took after the British on Lexington Green. Some of our greatest heroes are those who insisted on wearing the uniform even when being told they weren't wanted or needed. One of them was a scratch farmer from eastern Tennessee by way of Buncombe County, North Carolina, who would become the greatest hero of the First World War by capturing 132 German prisoners with just a small group of men. He was one of many Americans called upon to do extraordinary things. Another was a small, slight, bespectacled farmer from Jackson County, Missouri, who had never commanded anything except a plow. But he lied and he cheated to get into the field artillery because he could not bear the thought of his friends and neighbors going to war without him being there to help them. He commanded a battery of the 29th Field Artillery called the Dizzy D's. Dizzy D's were, as he once said, the hardest drinking group of Irishmen ever to stagger around the streets of Kansas City. He was a Baptist, leading people with names like Maloney and Driscoll and O'Farrell. He wrote his future wife, Bess, "I don't know what's going to happen when the first explosions hit and when the clouds of gas come." On a day in the Meuse-Argonne, 2 horses were shot out from under him, and one private looked at him trying to recover those bottle-thick glasses, and he said, "Harry Truman don't scare worth a damn." There were some others who were there. The 369th Infantry Regiment from Harlem, New York, known to history as the Harlem Hellfighters. When the United States Army marched down Fifth Avenue on its way to Europe, they were not allowed to enter the parade. When they reached Europe, they were assigned to the French Army because so many American units wouldn't fight with them. In the 2 years that they were in Western Europe, the Harlem Hellfighters suffered more casualties, 1,500, earned more decorations, and spent more time on the Western Front than any unit in the American Army. And when they returned, the people of New York righted a wrong. They led the parade up Fifth Avenue when the American Army came home. But back to Alvin York, that ordinary man called upon to do extraordinary things. York became a voice not only for veterans, but for his nation. And as the guns of Europe began to slowly approach the shores of the United States again, some questioned why America could once again be tangled up in the problems of Europe. Didn't we just fight the war to end all wars? But York would echo Thomas Paine's remarks from the Revolution and explain precisely why America had to fight. And he said, "Liberty and freedom and democracy are so very precious that you don't fight to win them once and then stop. Liberty and freedom and democracy are prizes awarded only to those people who fight to win them and then keep fighting eternally to hold them." When I'm asked what animates our work at VA, I say it's the stories of these men and women who sacrificed everything for us. It wasn't always so. President Lincoln set the tone for us during the Civil War by challenging us to care for those who have borne the battle. Just a few blocks from here, President Lincoln would get on a horse, unaccompanied, and follow ambulances up to hospitals that were located just north of the White House. He would reach in to those ambulances and start talking to those soldiers, asking them how they were, what was going on, what could he do for them. But the veterans of World War I, many years later, did not experience what Mr. Lincoln had hoped when he issued his proclamation in the second inaugural, that we hope for peace, fondly do we pray for it, but in order to ensure it, we not only have to honor the soldiers who bore the battle, we have to care for their families. Just a few short blocks from here, in the early 1930s, veterans of World War I marched on this town. They were met with tanks. Franklin Roosevelt was watching. He sent his wife into the mist to tell those troops that everything would be all right and that change was coming. And a young veteran who had served with York on the Western Front told the Washington Post, "The Army sent tanks and Franklin Roosevelt sent Eleanor." A few years later, after World War II was over, that great veteran of the First War came to the White House, and he understood the mistakes that had been made in between the two great wars. And unlike the predecessors at the Veterans Administration, he called upon his favorite Missourian, General Omar Bradley, to take control of VA. And in 2 short years, Omar Bradley administered 7.5 million scholarships to college for America's veterans. He built 52 hospitals in 2 years, and he pledged that America would never turn its back in the 20th century on those who had borne the battle. But once again, we fell down. As was mentioned, I am the son of a combat soldier. My father was grievously wounded in the invasion of Cambodia. He was a big man for his day, 6'2", 240. Today, that ain't an LSU quarterback. But in those days, it was a big fellow. He was so badly wounded that he spent a year at Tripler Army Hospital in Hawaii before he returned home to us, weighing half of what he did when he left. And only through the good graces of General Creighton Abrams was he allowed 3 years to recover and return to the division that Alvin York served in World War I, the 82nd, this time with the Appalachian Airborne, the All-American Division, the most decorated combat unit in the armed forces of the United States. And my father, as a senior officer in that division, was not allowed to wear his uniform off post. Friends, that was not Cambridge, Massachusetts. That was not Berkeley, California. That was Fayetteville, North Carolina, the heart of Richard Nixon country. There were no welcome home parades. The counterculture said it was acceptable to dismiss and even criticize our soldiers who fight to defend liberty. And my father reeled from the crisis. I was in the company of Miss Linda Hope, the daughter of Bob Hope, a few weeks ago as I dedicated our new cemetery in Los Angeles, and I recounted to her a story that I remember experiencing with my mother. Mr. Phil Donahue was on television, and you know what he was doing. He was running up and down the aisles with that microphone in his hand. Bob Hope was his guest. And he spent about the first 20 minutes of the show trying to get Bob Hope to say that the soldiers of Vietnam were somehow different from the soldiers that Bob Hope entertained in the Pacific and in Korea during that conflict, that somehow they were broken. And Bob Hope finally had enough. He said, you know, the soldiers I saw at Da Nang and Hue were the same soldiers that I saw on Okinawa, the same soldiers that I saw at Saipan, the same soldiers I saw in Australia, and the same soldiers I saw after the Bulge. All I remember after that is my mother yelling from the other room, "God bless you, Bob Hope." So today, though, we are finally people who praise the contribution of our warriors and know in our hearts that their service is all we have to defend our way of life. And while we can never thank them enough, we must continue to take historic steps to make sure that we fight for those who fought for us. We have finally integrated the VA with America's broader healthcare network. We are giving veterans the choice so that finally, if we can't provide them what they need, we give them the opportunity to go into the private sector. And for people like my father, after 30 years of serving, of being wounded, and of jumping out of airplanes in the Sicily drop zone at Fort Bragg, they no longer have to carry around an 800-page paper record that is the only source of their service, both in peacetime and in wartime. And we've done two other things that I believe are absolutely essential. We have talked about history here. I'm going to make reference to one of the more obscure successors to General Washington, a fellow by the name of Benjamin Harrison. Now, Benjamin Harrison is known for one thing. He served in between two non-successive terms of Grover Cleveland, and that was his contribution. But Benjamin Harrison had served as a major general during the Civil War, and he'd seen death on an unimaginable scale, and he was troubled. He was troubled by the reports that continued to come in from the War Department that hundreds, almost thousands, of officers and men in the Frontier Army were taking their lives with their own hands. That was the first cataloging of suicide by the United States government. Ladies and gentlemen, today, 20 veterans take their lives each and every morning. Of those 20, 60% are not in our VA. But this is not a crisis just of those who have worn the uniform. The leading cause of death for America's youth is not what it was when I was a teenager, car accidents. It is suicide. The New York City Police Department is now overrun with stories of veteran policemen ending their lives tragically. What we have promised this time is that we are going to take veterans, because most Americans understand at some level what veterans experience, what their fellow Americans go through when they put that uniform on and when they take that uniform off. We are going to finally have our first national conversation about mental health, homelessness, and addiction. It is long past time that a problem that we identified in the 1890s be addressed by the people of this nation, and we are going to do that. And to give you some historic perspective, most of the veterans who take their lives are from my father's generation. Lyndon Johnson left Washington, D.C. 50 years ago in January. That's how long their problems have been building, and it is long past time that we address them. So I want to leave you with a couple of stories, stories that are important to me and I believe important to those I've served with and those I have watched growing up. The first is from the greatest of airborne warriors, Matthew Bunker Ridgway. General Ridgway led the All-American Division to victory in North Africa and Sicily, and General Eisenhower tasked him with preparing the airborne assault on Hitler's fortress Europe. It was General Ridgway who was in command of the All-Americans, the Screaming Eagles, and the Red Devils of the British 1st Airborne. The night before D-Day, he couldn't sleep. He actually fell out of his cot. He was so restless. He was worried. And he reached for the Old Testament and he pulled down the book of Joshua. And he turned to the Battle of Jericho, up to that time the most ferocious battle in the history of the Hebrew people. And he looked to God's promise, I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. In 1986, Ronald Reagan awarded General Ridgway the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And he said, heroes come when they are needed. Great men step forward when courage seems in short supply. That is what we are about, not failing or forsaking those who step forward when courage seems in short supply, just as the warriors of 1776 stepped forward to create a new dawn for the West. And finally, we turn to the man whose greatest hero was the man we see above us. That was Dwight Eisenhower. When President Eisenhower was inaugurated, he was told on day one that he had inherited a presidential yacht, the Williamsburg. Ike, being a man of the heartland, thought that having a presidential yacht was an indulgence unworthy of a democracy at war, and he ordered it scrapped. But there was one officer in Washington, D.C., whose orders General Eisenhower could not countermand, Mamie's. She said, no, Ike, keep it. But when you take it out, only take it out with soldiers. So 5 months after Eisenhower was inaugurated, you know the kabuki dance that was about to take place. The president pulls up to the pier at the Washington Navy Yard. The Secret Service immediately deployed to separate the President of the United States from his troops. And as only a five-star general of the Army could do, Eisenhower yells, halt, get behind me, I know these men. And he walked up onto the deck, and there were 40 Korean War soldiers. Most of them were missing limbs. The others were horribly disfigured. And Eisenhower ordered those who could to stand at attention. And those who could do it, did it. And he said, you have a standing order from me. You never put your uniform away. You live to remind your fellow citizens why they sleep soundly at night. And that's what we're about. To never fail nor forsake the ordinary men and women called upon to do these extraordinary things, who step forward when courage seems in short supply, and whose existence reminds us that the cost of freedom is so high. That is why the work of this society is so important, to provide us with a link to the earliest times in the founding of this republic, when a few people took on the mightiest empire the world had ever seen, an empire that was capable in 1776 of launching an expeditionary force over 3,000 miles of ocean with 30,000 troops. And they did it, and they persevered, and they set the world on fire just as Tom Paine predicted that they would. And it is up to us, and is part of your inheritance here, to keep the flame of their memories alive. Because if we don't, then it won't be a foreign power that dips its foot in the Ohio or scales the Rockies. It will be us who have brought to end this great experiment that is really the last best hope of man. So I thank you for this high honor. I thank you for being here on Veterans Day and for remembering again those 41 million who have taken up arms since those farmers stood at Lexington Green and fought back the greatest force on the planet. Thank you all, and God bless you.
Secretary is a hard act to follow, but we'll do our best. I'm Jack Warren. I'm the Executive Director of the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. This weekend, our society opened an exhibition. I opened the doors so you could see into the room. If you haven't been in, please do. Not during the program. Called America's First Veterans. It traces the experience of Revolutionary War veterans from the end of the Revolutionary War through the 1860s, when the very last veterans of the American Revolution died, all of them over 100 years old by that time. The exhibition includes some remarkable treasures, and that's why one of the reasons you need to come back and see it, or see it when the program is done this evening. It includes the original 1792 biography of Deborah Sampson, one of the first recognized women combat veterans in American history. She disguised herself as a man, easier in a day when all you had to do was draw your hair up tight and in a ponytail, when men wore ponytails as well. Wore a Continental uniform, was a Massachusetts Continental soldier, and was wounded in battle near Tarrytown, New York. She took 2 musket balls in her thigh. And if anybody ever tells you that women don't make tough warriors, you see, Deborah didn't want to be discovered. And so she dug one of those musket balls out of her leg all by herself. She carried the other one in her leg until the day she died in 1827. It was there when she gave birth to 3 children after the war. She was granted a disability pension in 1792 under the law establishing those pensions when the new federal government was established. And that her life story, told in its first edition, is a great treasure. Another great treasure in the room is the Badge of Military Merit. You've all heard of the Badge of Military Merit, even if you don't know it. It's a purple cloth emblem, silk cloth, very small, about the size of a $50. It's the first American military decoration bestowed upon enlisted men for conspicuous service. George Washington established it in 1782, and it was revived in 1932. We refer to it as the Purple Heart. There are only 2 reputed original Purple Hearts surviving in the world today, and one of them is in the adjacent room. Don't miss it. But those aren't really the great treasure. The reason I went over right before I began speaking to open the doors so that if you could see into the room, you could see the face of a very old man. That's the real icon of this exhibition. It's a painting by John Nagel. Nagel was a pretty distinguished Philadelphia portrait painter of the second quarter of the 19th century. And he painted this painting and called it a pensioner of the Revolution. It portrays an elderly veteran whom Nagel encountered on a cold night in December 1829 on the streets of Philadelphia. The man was living in a makeshift shelter. This sounds familiar, doesn't it? And Nagel approached him. Yeah, Nagel was actually on his way to a friend's house for dinner, but he stopped and he approached the man and engaged him in conversation, which was difficult because the man spoke rather poor English. He was an immigrant from Germany. But it appeared, late Nagel learned that his name was Joseph Winter, and he'd come to America before the Revolution, had settled in eastern Pennsylvania in the town of Bethlehem, where he was a weaver. And he had joined the American forces and served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. After the war, he had married, he'd had children, but by 1829, his children were dead, his wife was dead. Weaving requires digital dexterity, it requires good eyesight, and those had faded by 1829. He could do no more work, and so he lived in the streets of Philadelphia, a homeless veteran. That painting is, as far as we can tell, the oldest portrayal of a homeless veteran in American history, perhaps in the history of the world. We've all seen that image, but we see it in photographs today. The painting is a reminder that the problems of veterans are not new. They are not easily solved, that the challenges that they face are challenges that that they faced in the generation of the Revolution are challenges that they faced, they face today, and that we as a civilized people must deal with. All of these challenges, symptomatic of the revolutionary generation, they survive in different ways today. Tonight, we're joined by a distinguished panel of historians who have worked on the experience of American veterans to discuss these experiences, explore how their experiences were in some instances peculiar to the circumstances of their generation, but also perhaps to establish some common themes. They've been waiting very patiently off to the side here, so let me introduce them to you. Brian Matthew Jordan. Brian, would you come out? Brian is Assistant Professor of History at Sam Houston State University. He's a cultural historian of the Civil War and its aftermath, and he is the author of Marching Home, Union Veterans and Their Unending Civil War. And he's also the co-editor of The War Went On, Reconsidering the Lives of Civil War Veterans. Our next panelist is Stephen Ortiz, who is Associate Professor of History at Binghamton University. He's the author of Beyond the Bonus March and GI Bill, How Veteran Politics Shaped the New Deal Era, and he is also the editor of Veterans Policies, Veterans Politics, New Perspective on Veterans in the Modern United States. And finally, Miranda, you've been very patient. Miranda Summers Lowe is a curator in the Division of Political and Military History at the Smithsonian. Her research specialties includes the National Guard and Reserve Forces history, women's military history, and the GI Bill. And she has served in the Army National Guard herself since 2002, including deployments to Iraq and the Horn of Africa. So you are our veteran of the evening. Thank you. The veterans of the Revolutionary War faced challenges associated with demobilization and reintegration into civilian life. Now, those are fancy 20th century, now 21st century ways of describing it, demobilization and reintegration. Many face challenges associated with disability, financial need, financial distress, poverty, and homelessness. And only after the passage of several decades did our nation fully honor, celebrate, and ultimately memorialize the service of Revolutionary War veterans. My assumption is that their experience set patterns that were repeated to varying degrees in the aftermath of major military actions of the 19th and 20th century, and that is what I hope we can talk a little bit about tonight. But before we dive in, perhaps each of you would tell us a little bit about your own work on veterans and what you see as peculiarly important about this theme for understanding American history more broadly. I'll begin with Professor Jordan. I have to put somebody on the spot, so I'll begin with you.
Sure. My book, Marching Home, is a social history of the men who won the Civil War, but really couldn't bear the peace that followed. Previous scholarship argued that Union veterans returned home from the Civil War and that they slipped into a period of so-called hibernation for at least 15 years after the conflict, during which they refused to write or to speak or to even think about the war. And the implications, of course, of that scholarship were enormous. For one, it supposed that Billy Yank slumbered as the nation retreated from the radical promises of Reconstruction, that he was somehow complicit in the bargain that achieved sectional reconciliation at the expense of a real reckoning with the war. And what my scholarship has done is to take a rather different approach and to suggest the myriad ways that the war continued to annex the lives of veterans every day for the rest of their lives. And not only did they tend to a staggering litany of physical, psychological, and emotional scars, of course, but they also returned home to a northern civilian society that had reached no consensus about the meaning of the war, their participation in such unprecedented violence, the meaning of emancipation. And so Billy Yank comes home to a society that wants to remember a war that he did not fight, war that Northern civilians remember was profoundly not the war that he'd fought. And so he finds himself adrift, needing urgently to explain and to contextualize his own experiences. And so I think the lessons there and the larger implications are really important. Because ultimately he could perhaps get over what he had seen and experienced at Antietam or Spotsylvania or Shiloh. What he could not get over was the way in which Northerners wanted to swiftly embrace the spirit of reconciliation, the way that they wanted to move so quickly beyond the war, the way that they wanted to frame his story. Right? And so he wanted to maintain authority over those experiences. He wanted to maintain his position as the custodian of the wartime experience. And that was an ongoing battle for recognition and acknowledgement that would last the rest of his life.
First of all, thank you for having me here. I'm really delighted to be here in this lovely room on this really wonderful day. So my research and my writing about the role of veterans and their organizations, much like this organization, although I tend to focus on 20th century organizations such as the Veterans of Foreign Wars and the American Legion. The American Legion, of course, is celebrating their centennial this year. And I focus on the ways that those organizations and the veterans within them have played an active role in American political life. A previous book has dealt with the ways that beyond that bonus march that we spoke about, Mr. Secretary Wilkie spoke about, that they have been very active participants in the creation of the ways that Americans handle veterans' policies and handle veterans' benefits. And there's a misconception, I think, that Americans have always been unbelievably generous with veterans' benefits. They have been somehow unanimously supported, and in fact, what has seemed to have been the case for a very long time now is that veterans and their organizations have had to fight and wage intense political battles, consistent, long-standing political battles to get the benefits that they think they deserve, and that's the focus of my research.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here this evening. This is a great honor. My research into veterans started out when I was serving as an Afghanistan war historian for the Army, and I thought, this will be simple, it's an operational story, and then I was charged with writing the mobilization sections and getting into the Guard and Reserve, and seeing how in this era there weren't those clear-cut lines of being at war and being at home, that our service members were routinely serving, commonly 3 tours of duty. Now we're getting up to 5, 6, 7. And that as much as I would have liked to keep it all within the military history perspective, that I really did have to look at what was happening between those mobilizations, which really pulled me into looking at that veteran experience, particularly how people were framing it in the modern era, coming back into their service, whether active duty or reservist. And in that research, it really guided me back many generations before to kind of look at different iterations of veterans programs and veterans benefits and reintegration and how those programs had evolved for the current service member. I think really if you're looking at current events right now, a lot of the topics that we'll talk about tonight are very timely because these are patterns that really do start as early as the American Revolution.
I'd like to begin, because this theme really important to understand the experience of veterans of the Revolution, but I can tell that it's equally important for that of later conflicts, is what happens to veterans at the time of demobilization? And Professor Jordan, you've already sort of tipped your hand a little bit, so but I was surprised to learn that from just the brief remarks that you made, how similar that experience was to the experience of Revolutionary War veterans. In both cases, sort of in the vernacular, I mean, my expectation is that most modern Americans would think that the victors of the Revolutionary War and the victors of the Union Army were men who could expect to get free lunch in America for the rest of their lives, that they would be heroes from the instant that they went home. And in the case of the Revolutionary War, this was definitely not the case. The Army was discontented because it hadn't been properly paid. Most of the men who were discharged in the summer of 1783 were given debt certificates by the Continental Army, which weren't worth very much and which they sold immediately for a few pennies on the dollar. And that was how they managed to get the money they needed to get home or to buy some basic clothes for civilian life. And that was it. And they reached home to communities which had been divided by war, particularly in large parts of the country, in parts of New York and in the Deep South where loyalism had been common. Communities who were really anxious to put the war behind them really quickly. And for this reason, they not only had they suffered financially at the end of the war and hadn't been, the promises that had been made to them had not been fulfilled, but they did not find themselves as welcome as we would like to think that they were. Same experience for Union veterans.
I think it's a very similar experience, with the one exception of scale, right? 1.5 million men will call themselves Union veterans immediately after the Civil War. So it's an enormous scale. The actual physical process of demobilization is remarkably efficient. 800,000 men will be demobilized in just a few months after Appomattox, all of that expertly choreographed by Montgomery Meigs, the quartermaster general. But no one really anticipates the social problems that will accompany demobilization. The wartime voluntary aid societies, like the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission, which had done such marvelous work during the war, they would both shutter their headquarters in the fall of 1865. And veterans were really left to kind of navigate their way home by themselves. And so much of this, I think, owes to kind of the classical small r Republican citizen soldier ideology, this notion that there's a great fear, right, of a standing army, and that we want you to very quickly cede any sort of authority or distinction as you return home, and that's very palpable in many of the speeches that are delivered at ceremonies welcoming veterans home and then demanding pretty quickly that they get on with the work of their lives. There's not yet that link to understand how the experience of war will continue to manifest.
In terms of World War I veterans, I don't think there was ever a sense that the U.S. government was not prepared to reintegrate them into American society. The government had looked at the Civil War pension system and the Civil War veterans process, and during the war had set up a very clear bureaucratic approach to integrating veterans in terms of health care, in terms of vocational training, in terms of employment services. But they were scattered amongst a bunch of different federal agencies: Public Health Service, vocational services, the Army does quite a bit of this, and so a War Risk Insurance Bureau. But we're speaking in Washington now. We know sometimes how that scattering of bureaucratic of goals, right, can not actually lead to the results that are necessary. And so despite the fact that World War I veterans were the target of lots of legislation to ease that transition, they simply overwhelm what the government had expected in terms of the use of services. This will ultimately lead to the creation of the Veterans Bureau that will consolidate all these different approaches. But again, this is not something that the government is quick to address. The U.S. government's not the federal government's not quick to address this. It is the American Legion and the officials of the American Legion who pressure Congress to make the necessary changes, one. Two, both the Veterans of Foreign Wars and the American Legion will set up a very important part of Washington, which is Washington-based lobbying arms. And they'll set them up right after World War I, and they become part of the congressional world of testimony and of buttonholing congressional members to push for the types of changes necessary to reintegrate World War I veterans into American life. So it is a struggle, right? It is definitely a struggle, despite the fact, again, no country probably was as prepared to have dealt with that struggle as the U.S. government was circa 1918, 1919, in that time period. Yeah.
Sure. There's not an easy answer in what demobilization is like in the global war on terror. On the one hand, you have the advantage that we've had really 18 years to work on it and tried a lot of different approaches, which I think is one of the first things you see in this period, that we're to the point where we have, depending on how you want to count it, roughly the same number of GWAT veterans as you did World War II veterans, but they're not all coming back at the same time. So there's a little bit of an incremental phenomena, and you'll see that, you know, you try different methodologies for how to do this. And the other thing that I would bring up is just the speed that it is possible to demobilize, where in an emergency, we can have a service member from combat to their living room in 24 hours. That can happen. So even as where, you know, previously it would have taken how long to even get you back from Europe to the States, plus the demobilization. So you'll see this pattern where we're spending anywhere from 4 days to 2 weeks, maybe upwards of a month, to send someone back home. And there's been, you know, a few different complications of that. Especially, I think, if we knew that these wars would have lasted that long, we would have really done demobilization differently. Some early reports coming out of these mobilizations around 2004 were showing about 40% of soldiers, this was an Army report, demobilizing were already medically unfit for the next deployment, right? But the mindset was, we won't need them for the next deployment. That's okay. We can go ahead and push them either off of active duty or back to their units. They'll have the time to recover. So I think you really see that time factor and just the scale, but you can also see how there was a better infrastructure for this generation of veterans to come in, with these existing strong lobbyist groups, with a stronger VA, and just, you know, so many living veterans from other conflicts who didn't want to see the same thing happen again. If I can share an experience from my deployment to Iraq, when we got back, you know, this was a whole unit. We landed in New Jersey. There was snow on the ground. Nobody could even breathe the cold air. And there was a group of Vietnam veterans there waiting for us. And they made us breakfast. And we had a chaplain come up, and he was like, you're going to spend about 2 weeks demobilizing. I'm going to tell you why. I was in Vietnam. It took about 2 days for me to get home, and I looked down one day in my mother's home, and I realized the dirt under my fingernails was still from Vietnam. So you're going to be a little bored here, but we're at least going to get you back on the right time zone. You know, you're going to take the time to see a doctor, see a dentist before we send you home. Now, that was during the era where you were spending about 2 weeks demobbing. At this point, for a lot of individuals, it's back down to 2 or 3 days, and that's usually at the person's request, because at this point, it's so common to go out and back, and those kinds of services are available more. They can walk into the VA, right? Like, they don't necessarily have to do that when they're still coming back from that deployment.
I'd like to pick up on something Miranda just mentioned. And what we haven't mentioned is a very successful demobilization of World War II veterans, right? And one of the reasons why the World War II, all of you I'm sure know, that the GI Bill prepared the, paved the ground in 1944 for the readjustment into American life and that demobilization process. But it is not a coincidence that that GI Bill had more or less American Legion authorship. Basically, American Legion writes the GI Bill, right? Because that generation of World War I veterans, much like the Vietnam veterans that Miranda just described, were intent to not have the same level of a system being overwhelmed, of poor readjustment, of all the different, from whether it be from unemployment to the Great Depression, whatever you name it, they were intent to not have that replicated with the World War II generation, and will, right the year before they write the GI Bill, will open up their doors to World War II veterans and then start pushing for a GI Bill, and so that cross-generational veterans' attention ends up being a really important part of the veterans' story of readjustment over time, or of not readjustment, and when it comes to Vietnam veterans not feeling adequately prepared to come home by their World War II cohort. So these cross-generational things are very powerful, and what is handed off from one cohort to the next matters a great deal.
There's an enormous difference between the three wars, or the four wars the three of us represent, and the modern conflicts which Miranda studies. And that is, our wars ended clearly. They had closure. It was VE
Korean
Day
War
and
veterans would
VJ Day.
contest that.
Civil
Korean
War
War
veterans.
veterans would contest that.
Civil War
Korea,
veterans would
I
too.
didn't, I would lump Korea in with Vietnam. It's,
Yeah.
it's much more ragged.
Right.
Whatever the flaws of the way in which the government handled the resolution of the Revolutionary War or the Civil War or the First or Second World War, we know when they came to an end. Your guys got parades, mine didn't, but but there was a moment of closure and of group identity, which I think is lacking in a way for veterans of these almost interminable conflicts. I mean, it will be very difficult, those of us who teach history, to ever ask students, when did the conflict in Afghanistan begin and end? We'll expect them to be able to give you Fort Sumter and Appomattox. I mean, you know, these are, and that it has to affect the way veterans are perceived and their own experience. I mean, they do not represent a single coterie in the way that those of earlier wars do. Is that fair?
I think as a society, Americans really like the idea of the citizen soldier and picking up and serving your country and performing that duty. We also love the idea of the military professional, that we are trained, we are regulated, and especially since the all-volunteer force and the end of the draft, military careers are stretching out longer. I think that's part of the difference as well, that we hold both of these ideals in very high stature, and they don't necessarily always get along with each other. Doing your 2-year stint, not the same as doing 20 years and getting a pension. And with these wars going on so long, I think we're moving more into that, where we have so many people where they are veterans, but they're also still in uniform or serving in some fashion. And it kind of pulls at that idea whether or not they're still, you know, serving their country and reacting to a need.
Let's turn for a few minutes to, we are entering some dark territory here, but disability, financial need, distress, poverty, the origin of pensions of various kinds. Now, in the English-speaking world, they go back to Elizabethan poor laws, and essentially that's their root, right, is that when disabled soldiers were sent home from the battlefields of England or of Europe, and they were in the English army, if they had been disabled, particularly if they had been crippled in the war, if they had lost a limb, the government made a commitment to support them, but it looks, at least to the historian, like a commitment to keep them off of the local poor rolls, not impose them on the local poor relief system. And that's the great grandfather of all military pension systems, it seems, is a form of poor relief. And even into the debate about Revolutionary War pensions in the very early 19th century, when Revolutionary War veterans were in their 50s and then 60s and 70s, when this debate was heating up, it is mostly a debate about relieving poverty, and not so much one of providing veterans with compensation, just compensation for duty faithfully performed. There's a big change in America in the 1820s over that issue. It's the first big pension debate in American history that produces the Pension Act of 1832, which is the first general service pension. But even thereafter, there is this residual sense that this is not something earned, but something given. I wonder how has that died? What that is, for Union veterans of the Civil War, for example, when they begin drawing pensions, is there a sense of popular resentment, misunderstanding?
Union veterans were keen students of history, and indeed they understood the resistance that they would face in fighting for pensions. James McCormick Dalzell, popularly known as Private Dalzell, fought with the 116th Ohio. He wrote one of the early biographies of John Gray, who was one of the last surviving Revolutionary War pensioners. And so they connected their own experiences to those early debates in the early Republic over Revolutionary War pensions. They understood just what they would face. And in the space of their veterans organization, the Grand Army of the Republic, the largest Northern Veterans Order, they began to articulate a strikingly modern notion of veterans' rights. They began to make the argument around their GAR campfires that pensions were a debt of gratitude or a debt of honor, the phrases that they commonly deployed. And they would sue for increasingly capacious definitions of who was entitled to a pension. Initially, of course, during the war itself, you get pensions for folks who are missing arms or legs as a result of battle. Enlisted men pensioned at $8 per month, officers up to $30 per month. But then due to the activism of the GAR over time, over the course of the late 19th century, you get pension legislation that 1890 is the really important year, the Dependent Pension Act, which provides basically a disability pension for anyone who was honorably discharged. And then in 1907, you get pension legislation, a pension act that will provide basically an old age retirement pension for anybody who is honorably discharged. But they're the first to, I think, articulate this notion that there's a special relationship that's open between the federal government and veterans. They do that in the space of the GAR. And the GAR itself, when those pensions are inadequate, the GAR is doing a lot of the work of poverty relief in the late 19th century. Fraternity, charity, and loyalty were their three hallmarks, and the charity piece was really important. They're paying for costly medical procedures that the government refuses to pay for. They're burying soldiers in paupers' graves. They're heating veterans' homes for the winter. And so even once you get this pension labyrinth, it's still not enough.
Well, interestingly, the World War I era veterans legislation looked at what Brian just suggested and said, we want none of that, none of the pension stuff, because it's been corrupt, it's been unbelievably expensive, it is as capacious, to use your phrase, as can be, and what we will do is give pensions to service-connected disability. Absolutely. We will help veterans on their feet with vocational training. We will help them with unemployment services. We will get them reintegrated into society. But we are not doing a pension, period. Not. Again, what they will ultimately decide to do is pass what is known as adjusted compensation, which becomes known colloquially as the bonus, which then leads to the bonus march. But a pension was seen as completely beyond the pale of what kind of progressive era, cost and efficiency-minded professional bureaucrats were interested in doing now in the early 20th century. So, however, something did change a great deal, and that is not that the pensions were seen, as Brian just mentioned, pensions were seen not just as poverty relief, but as old age poverty relief. And between 1919 and 1945, of course, is the Social Security Act of 1935. And that changes the conversation about pensions, because old age pensions that were seen as only for veterans now become part of American life with the federal involvement in old age pensions. That changes the nature of the conversation going forward. So the GI Bill doesn't deal with old age pensions per se. The Social Security is there. However, it does deal with these forward-looking things like education and home loans and small business loans and veterans preference and all these things to help veterans reintegrate, but not pensions.
Well, I was hoping you were going to bring up the words New Deal.
Right.
Because I think in looking at sort of the original GI Bill, it makes a lot of sense in the context of being a New Deal program in a time where government is expanding rapidly. It's getting into a lot of new areas in American life, whether it's housing or transportation or old age care and to an extent even medical care. Now, when you move into the all-volunteer force, there were a series of conversations kind of early on where a lot of really famous economists in the room who are like, what if we could make military service entirely market-based? A young Milton Friedman was there. And they wanted bonuses, and they were like, we just need to make this entirely market-based. But the idea being more that you would have more enlistment bonuses and retention bonuses, and perhaps, you know, should combat arise, you would get combat bonus, but, you know, not as much on the social service side of things. That idea did not work particularly well. Those bonuses were never responsive enough to what was happening, both in like the life and health of the Department of Defense as an organization, and also as far as what was happening in the civilian economy. So in a way, we don't do the combat bonus anymore. In other ways, we really do, because it's really expanded. We paid much better, and we get a lot of these other services serving in the military that you didn't used to, whether it's family care or health care. But I think you also have to look at how perhaps other countries have structured this. Like, I remember I was talking to a Canadian officer once, and we were, looking through what their militaries cost, and I was like, oh wait, that's a lot cheaper, because you guys don't pay for college and you don't pay for health care, right? Because anyone gets that. So we've kind of structured things a little bit differently in America in that those services become military expenses, right? Like healthcare for military families, or tuition assistance, and then to an extent some of these bonuses as well. But we don't kind of do the same. Spend 2 years in, you get a victory bonus. I think a lot of people would probably be pretty satisfied by that idea that but it hasn't been the way that we've done it.
I would go back to something Brian said too, that the veteran service organizations have continued that level of care for indigent veterans in their local communities, right? That despite the fact, so when you ask about pensions being really about poverty relief, I mean, one of the ways that the veteran service organizations operate is to offer charitable aid, yes, but also connections to employment and connections to business, small business ownership, and all these kinds of other ways that are, in effect, poverty relief, right? All of these things are, but they are often conducted, I think, more through the organizations and locally than they are as a federal pension.
Secretary Wilkie
Yeah.
talked, he said at the end, and we gave him a hearty round of applause when he talked about an energetic initiative to deal with veteran homelessness. And I'd invited everybody to look, when I was making my opening remarks, in the door at this portrait of a homeless Revolutionary War veteran who the artist met living in a makeshift shelter on the streets of Philadelphia. And I'm sure that tonight, in a makeshift shelter on the streets of Philadelphia, is a homeless veteran. We meet them on the streets. They have a cardboard sign. Whether they're authentic veterans or not, they are claiming the status of veterans because they feel that that a veteran has a claim on what? On our generosity, on our gratitude, this seems to be an unresolved question through our entire history. We've been struggling with it. And I think the thing that I've learned so far, and I learned from Secretary Wilkie, is sort of the more time passes, the more these things seem to stay the same. We have many of the same issues today that we had in 1820. Is that fair? Or do you feel in the years you've studied we've made dramatic progress?
I think in some respects, in the infrastructural issues, obviously we've made progress. Civil War veterans did not have a Veterans Administration to return to. They had only a nascent pension bureau. And so infrastructurally, we, of course, have come a long way in dealing with veterans' issues. What we haven't done so good of a job as a nation in doing is realizing some of the deeper, more intellectual issues about the meaning of service and what all that entails. How do veterans, should they continue to have authority over the history of their war? What does that look like? What does acknowledgement and recognition look like? And those have been questions that are much more difficult for us to answer. We have had no national, meaningful conversation about rituals of reintegration or about what that acknowledgement looks like. For Civil War veterans, it was finding a space to share their war stories honestly, truthfully, and urgently, finding a receptive and a respectful audience where they could make sense of and contextualize their experiences. And that, I think, is so much more important to veterans, or as important as some of the infrastructural issues, and that's the piece that's been really, really difficult for us to get at as a nation.
It is difficult. And part of the problem, what complicates the issue, is the Veterans Bureau, Veterans Administration, Veterans Affairs is very keen to say that if men and women go into combat and come back, we have the tools to reintegrate them into American life. And quite simply, that's not always the case. But that ethos of rehabilitation has been a powerful one for a very long time. That, yes, we are sending people into combat, and yes, many will come back and be able to lead very productive lives. And let's be very clear here that the percentages of veterans who lead normal productive lives is very, very high, right? So when we focus simply on, or focus on the homeless, that is not the kind of normative experience, right? But, so what we have said is that when we send men and women into conflict, into combat, we have the means, we have the professional skill, we have the national will to make that right. And the professional skill, the national will, have not always been commensurate to that challenge. And so this problem persists, and I personally don't simply know if there's a good answer to it. I know that many of the collective endeavors, starting back in the Vietnam era with the vet centers starting in 1979, many of the community-based approaches to these challenges appear to be the best way to go. But we also have an enormous infrastructure of hospitals and what have you, and so to balance out those economic imperatives has been rather difficult. I know that there's an attempt to put more into kind of community-based efforts, and I'll let Miranda speak to those. But again, the national will and the professional skill simply has not always been there and been able to deal with these challenges.
Yeah, thank you. At least from what I've seen, we have a tendency to want to focus on, the end of the road, whether it's homelessness or suicide or permanent disability. And what I have seen really improve over the past few years, probably the last decade or so, is the willingness and the national will to address problems before it hits that point. To look at some of these factors, like who needs consistent mental health care? Who is a disabled veteran but is still able to work but still needs help with that, or they're underemployed? Who's living off of credit cards, right? Who looks like they have a nice life, they're not homeless yet, but it's a day-to-day struggle. And I think those programs are gaining a lot of momentum, and I think that will kind of be the future of where this is going, but it's harder to get people to be passionate about programs like that. And I think within a lot of these veterans communities, they're getting more understanding, but I think over time there's kind of been an issue of, are we the ones who give service? Are we the pillars of the community who, run the 4th of July parade, or are we the ones that need the charity? And looking within their own organizations or, perhaps their communities to see who does need that care earlier on.
Let me reach a happier place. But just as complicated as these, which is how we come to celebrate, honor, memorialize, or in your thinking, take control of the memory of war and the service of soldiers who hold that close to themselves in the early decades, certainly after their service. We see it in the work we did on this exhibition, looking at the earliest published memoirs of ordinary soldiers of the Revolution, and which I think are some of the earliest published memoirs of enlisted men, probably ever published in the world. in which they talk about their experience. And they all, to a man, say at some point in the introduction or the preface, they all say something. I'm going to tell you about something. You know, I know you all know this. You think you know the story of the American Revolutionary War, but you don't. If you weren't there, you can't really grasp it. I can only give you in these few pages a pale approximation of what this experience was like. And then they try to convey the harrowing experience of war. And you can see that at this point in 18 teens and 20s and even into the 30s, they have a very strong proprietary sense about that story. It's their story. But then by the 1830s and 40s, as they grow older, and as at least society seems to have a greater inclination to remember fondly, to memorialize their service, you see the erection of the first monuments. It seems that that's a pattern which is replicated over and over again, and it takes decades for a society to reach that place. Is it fair?
I think that's fair in the case of the Civil War. I mean, certainly by 1913, the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg, in 1938, you get the blue-gray reunions at Gettysburg with veterans ready to reconcile. But I would point out that kind of simmering right beneath the surface were lingering sectional animosities, and also that many of the most grievously wounded and injured veterans had already passed away, and indeed many of them would die within a decade of Appomattox. Veterans of the Civil War, Union veterans, believed that they were to be the custodians of their history. They felt a great urgency to write, to record, to talk about the distinctiveness of their experiences. I'll give you just one example. 24-year-old Daniel Eldridge, who fought with a New Hampshire regiment, brought home a souvenir from the Battle of Deep Bottom in the form of a piece of rebel lead that was wedged between the two tendons of his left arm. And the first thing that he does when he gets home in the summer of 1865 is to begin work on a memoir, what he believes at first will consume no more than a dozen pages of foolscap. But he urgently needs to write, to understand and contextualize his experience, his injury. And daily work on that memoir by 1867 brought it to more than 600 pages, including dozens of hand-inked campaign and battle maps. He's literally writing through his pain with every new word, sending currents of pain traveling up that limb as that rebel lead is pressing on those tendons. They had a need to record more than 700 Union regimental histories. Grand Army of the Republic meeting places, meeting halls, became museums, reliquaries of artifacts and battlefield relics. Veterans would collect other units' regimental histories. They would hold reunions simply to swap war stories, publish newspapers in every major city, not just to engage in the work of charity that we talked about earlier, but to engage in this act of recording what they had done, what they had seen for themselves and for posterity.
So this is a tough one because World War I veterans are actually pretty active right after the war in terms of commemoration. The building of statues, the building of stadiums, the building of all kinds of different monuments to the World War I cause. And even the creation of the American Legion as a kind of monument to wartime service is an act of memory production. So they're quite active early on. The World War II generation, I believe, takes some time. And I would point to one difference between the World War I and World War II generation, that the meaning of the war for World War II generation was never in doubt. But what World War I meant was very much questionable for those who came back from France. What was it exactly that they were fighting for? How should it be commemorized? So how should fighting in the trenches and the horrors of that modern war be remembered? As heroism, as victimhood, as sacrifice, as valor? There was an array of options there, and veterans and their organizations worked very hard to put their stamp on what the meaning was for them right away, I think. Whereas when you hear stories of World War II generation, it's like they all came back, they all went to school, and they had kids. right? And that was their act of commemoration. It was like to forget about it, to leave the Great Depression and World War II behind and get on with a productive, successful life. The World War I generation really sits in this, and that's not to mention at all even the way this is addressed in terms of literature, right? So the lost generation, novelists and poets and what have you, who immediately start working on what the war experience was like and trying to understand and shape the memory of that war. So they're two very different, I think, qualitative experiences based on the types of conflicts, the generations involved, and the ability to get on and go to school and start having kids that the World War II generation had thanks to the GI Bill. So.
I don't have a lot to say about what global war and terror memorials will be like. The first are starting to come up, but I can give a little bit about my daily commute working at the Smithsonian, and if you've ever looked around, or those of you who have lived in Washington a long time, you see that most of those buildings were built in the 1950s and 60s, and that if you would have walked through that area, even at the end of World War II, you'd see the castle, the Natural History Museum, and a bunch of government buildings. And part of that plan is we were going to have a great war museum on the mall. And this all gets set up after World War I, and we're gonna have this great place to show our technology, tell the story of our military service members, and that kind of gets interrupted by World War II, including taking some of the great equipment back so it can be used again. And then by the time it's time to build this again, it's the Vietnam era, and the appetite for a national war museum on the mall is not there. And this takes a number of great forms now in the Air and Space Museum and the National Museum of American History and some others. But what I think is kind of interesting about this is up until that point, the National Mall really wasn't an area for war memorials, right? And then you get the Vietnam Memorial, and then that kind of sparks the appetite for the Korean War Memorial and then the World War II Memorial. And I think there's a couple of things that's interesting about that. First, we do have these great memorials and monuments on the mall, but we don't necessarily have the information and the understanding there. There are wonderful military museums across the services, and there are excellent military history exhibits within those museums, but we don't have the same place where you go and learn. On the other hand, what you see about these monuments is they're very much veteran-driven, getting them there, and they take really different forms. I think Vietnam being one of the most famous, and that was a place of healing. I think by the time the World War II generation came around and the energy for that memorial builds up, that's much more, it's very monumental, it's a place of reflection. So I think we have ended up with the National Mall being kind of this beautiful place where, yes, there is sort of a lot of discussion about war, but it's very much kind of crafted by the people who served in those wars.
And Miranda did not mention a World War I memorial, as all of you know. Or should probably know that there is a still hotly contested, plan for some kind of World War I memorial. And when people say, well, there's no World War I memorial, I always say, yes, in Washington, there's not a national memorial on the mall. I mean, of course, there's a memorial to the Washingtonians who died in the war, but not a federal one. But there is, however, in both Kansas City, commemorated in 1921, and then throughout Indianapolis, around the American Legion's national headquarters, a rich memorial space for World War I that was created immediately after, right? And these are built in the 1920s. And so the World War I memorialization is diffuse, and it's not in Washington. It's everywhere but nowhere, essentially. Yeah.
And quite staggeringly beautiful in Europe. The American Battlefield Monument Commission
unbelievable,
monuments,
yes.
overseen by General Pershing. And there's the construction of the 3 primary World War I memorials in France, which is quite staggering. I want to thank the 3 of you for being with us tonight. And also give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. I think you can cover anything from 75 to the present, so it's, we might be here a long time. Yes, sir. Perhaps try the question again so everybody can
wanna
hear
start?
you.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry we
Okay.
didn't get
All right.
this to you.
Okay, is this working?
It is.
All right, you have two professors up there and somebody that served. Thank you for serving. Addressed to the two professors, what do your students think of the military? And what do your colleagues think of the military? And then, after you give that answer, what can you do to change that?
Yeah. So you want me to go on this, Brian?
Go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Brian teaches at an institution that has a very large veteran population, so he's in many ways better poised to answer this question than I am. So SUNY Binghamton University, as we have rebranded ourselves, is a place that was very much anti-war in the 1970s, had been very strongly anti-war. I've heard many stories from Vietnam-era veterans who went to school there, who had a horrible time there. And so the institution itself has a reputation as being inhospitable to military history and what have you. I think that has changed profoundly since 9/11. There were somewhere upwards of 55, I shouldn't say this, it's being recorded about the number, a lot of Binghamton alum who were in the towers when they came down. And I think that actually changed the understanding of what war and what subsequent military service means to Binghamton students in particular. We also have a very large Jewish population, Jewish American population, many of whom either plan to serve or will serve in Israeli Defense Forces, and so their understanding of military is informed by that perspective. So I think what used to be a rather typical kind of liberal left, anti-war campus has changed quite a bit on that. My colleagues, I would say there are some who are not particularly interested in military history, but as Brian well knows, my esteemed colleague Diane Somerville just won a book prize on the American Civil War and the suffering of people in the American Civil War. So we have a good subset of people, and a colleague Howard Brown who teaches about the French, or writes about the French Revolution and talks about violence and war. And so I think that storyline of academia being anti-war or anti-war specific military in the 15, 20 years I've been involved in it. I do remember when I first started doing the topics of veterans, getting very peculiar stares about people, why would you do that, right? But I think that has changed dramatically over time. So your second question was, or your follow-up question is, what should we do to change that? I think that some of that change is underway as we speak, as we sit here.
And I would echo much of what Steve just said. Sam Houston State has a significant student veteran population. We have a Veterans Resource Center on campus. At our graduations, we give stoles to our veteran students to identify them as veterans. There's a special veterans graduation ceremony. We do quite a lot to support our veterans. My colleagues as well support military history. We have a War and Society track in our graduate program in history. So we're doing a lot of positive things at Sam Houston State. I would also say in academia as a whole, I'm now co-editing a book series with the University of Massachusetts Press, which will bring together work from across academic disciplines on veterans issues. And so there's a real sense that veteran studies is beginning to cohere as a discipline, and so I think the change is already in the academy.
Thank you all for coming. My question is for Dr. Warren about the American Revolution. And you mentioned how the government essentially wrote these IOUs to the Continental soldiers, and then the soldiers sold them. My question is about what happened afterwards when speculators who bought these bonds, mostly that supported Hamilton, and Hamilton wanted them to be honored as contracts. And Madison and his supporters wanted the government to help out these veterans who had sold them for pennies on the dollar. How was that tension resolved?
Well, it was resolved in favor of the speculators. That is when the Continental Army disbanded, almost everyone was paid with Continental debt certificates, and almost all of those men were penniless, and so they had no choice. Very few of them had any choice but to negotiate them immediately to someone who would pay them in some form of cash. And so almost all of those debt certificates wound up in the hands of speculators, not what within a decade would be referred to as their original holders, i.e. the soldiers to whom they had been issued. When Hamilton's funding system to establish the economic system of the new federal government is being debated in Congress in 1789, 90, 91, a recurring theme is, don't we need to do justice to the original holders, that is, to soldiers, but in some cases, civilians for whom similar debt certificates have been issued when their cattle or their other agricultural produce have been taken from them. There was a practical problem. Washington considered this. Washington, discussed it with his cabinet. And the practical problem was that there were almost no credible records at that point of how those debt certificates had been issued. Most of them had been issued in great haste, and a lot of the records were held at the state level, if they existed at all. And so actually tracking down the people to whom those original holders would have been extremely difficult. And Hamilton makes the argument, and Hamilton had been a pretty serious advocate of veterans' rights in the Congress in the early 1780s. He said, if we do this thing, that is, if we do not pay off people who have invested in what are, in fact, very questionable securities of the United States, if we don't pay them off now, we will destroy the credit of the United States. And Hamilton, this was not an easy argument for Hamilton to make. He felt that he was pained by the dispossessing ordinary soldiers of their pay. But he couldn't see any other way to establish the credit of the United States. And it was done. I'm not making an excuse for it. It was done on the backs of the soldiers who had secured American independence. And they wound up fighting for the remainder of their lives. The debates about doing justice to original holders actually fuels the pension debates of the 18-teens and 20s leading up to the pension law of 1832, which is the first universal service pension law, is that, look, we didn't pay these people properly when they were young men, at least those who have survived now to be in their 60s and 70s. Certainly we can pay them now when the government has plenty of money. In 1832, the United States, the income of the United States was actually 4 times the national budget. Can you imagine such a thing? That is only needing to spend 1/4 of the money that the government takes in revenue. And so at that particular moment, the United States was extraordinarily flush, and so did this, what at the time was regarded as a remarkable thing, but only for that relatively small number of men who survived. As many as 250,000 Americans served in arms during the Revolutionary War, which pales, I know, beside those of later wars, but so did our population. That was an enormous percentage of American men. Something like 35,000 men lived to claim pensions under the law of 1832. And those are the only ones to whom that kind of justice was ever done, and then very belatedly. Oh.
Good evening. I've been a naval officer for the last 10 years, but I also spent 15 years collecting oral interviews of World War II veterans. And I've noticed an interesting sort of paradox as I've talked to both my peers in service in the global war on terror, but also those who served 70 years ago. And that is that there's a cohort that we're very familiar with who were traumatized and suffer with the horrors of things that they witnessed on battlefields. But there also is a cohort on the opposite end of the spectrum who are traumatized and suffer with anguish because they were unable to serve in in a sphere of the war that directly impacted victory, or what we conceive as victory. So my question is, throughout history, have we treated combat veterans differently than non-combat veterans? And particularly now in an all-volunteer force, do we continue to draw that distinction? And if we do or don't, is that the healthy answer for those who are volunteering to serve?
Sure. As far as the distinction between combat and non-combat veterans, some of that really even comes down to the kind of work that was done. There was a big discussion over whether or not like war industrial workers would have access to the GI Bill. It was decided no, but that was, you know, one of those moments where, you know, there were military officers who were there in those plants supervising it, and their daily conditions were about the same as the war workers, and one group got these benefits and one group didn't. Coming into it now, I too have met some of these individuals who feel that somehow their service didn't justify access to the benefits. Particularly, you see this a lot with female veterans, where sort of their concept of, you know, what they were allowed to do in their service, you know, they feel doesn't equate to what somebody who had a more, you know, combat-focused profession did. And so even when they are struggling, they're not going to the VA and they're not going to these veterans organizations to ask for help.
So I've encountered this issue quite a bit in the teens and 20s in particular, after the American Legion was founded. The American Legion was very specific. You had to be a member of the military during World War I, but not necessarily a combat soldier or in France. And that meant that half the organization's eligible members were what the VFW members called stay-at-home soldiers, right? And so there was a lot of intra-veteran kind of conflict over how to advocate for policies that were expensive when you knew that roughly 2.5 of the 4.5 million had not actually seen combat. And so that is why there was a larger federal effort to really address service-connected disability, right? And really focus on that and not focus on larger veterans policies. So yes, it can be a rather contested, who is a real veteran, who's a true veteran can be contested. I have not found the same level of anguish you have for those who were not on the front lines or what they deem to be the front lines of service. I think there is a way to conceptualize military service of any sort, recognizing you were part of a large kind of machinery that where all is necessary. I would argue too that as the kind of teeth to tail ratio continues to get smaller, right? That there are fewer people actually in combat compared to the number of people in combat positions, that it's awfully hard to tell the other 90% of people, by the way, your service doesn't matter, right? And so I find that, I have not personally found that level of anguish. It may be, what that might be is the success of American propaganda, right, during World War II. We're all doing our part, no matter how small, no matter seemingly how insignificant. That has alleviated some of that, but I don't, that's my best answer for you. But those differences amongst veterans, though, were real. And in fact, they had a real impact on the GI Bill for Vietnam veterans, because they tried to think of a GI Bill that would just prioritize the Vietnam combat soldiers and Marines, and everyone said, well, wait a minute, we've got soldiers, we have military personnel stationed all around the globe. How are we going to give them more than the guys in West Berlin or in West Germany? And so in order to pay for it then, for all veterans of the Vietnam War era, the relative benefits are far less significant than the GI Bill benefits for World War II veterans. But this debate over who's a real combat, who's really who's serving here, were pronounced even in that policy debate of the Vietnam era GI Bill.
You see this manifest in a really interesting debate over whether there should be a specific class of pensions for ex-prisoners of war after the Civil War. And what's interesting about this is that the Grand Army of the Republic, the great notorious pension lobby, actually many of the posts will petition Congress to oppose a specific ex-POW
Yes, sir.
Somewhat tangential to the other gentleman who was just asked a question. My father and his brothers all served in combat in World War II. We then went in the early 1970s to an all-volunteer army in which I served in a non-combatant role. We have had volunteer armies since the early 1970s. We haven't declared war, I believe, since 1941, and we have some relatively interminable conflicts of, to some at least, some dubious reasons. Do you think that all these things have affected the perception of the military and the military career amongst the large majority of people now who do not have any relative or even necessarily a friend in uniform?
Go for it.
For it.
Yeah.
Yeah, if anything, you know, when they do surveys of which government agencies Americans like, the military always comes up as, you know, most trusted, most professional. And I think a lot of how that happened was through professionalism. That, you know, although, you know, we haven't had a declared war, you know, people have felt protected by their military, and military personnel in general are getting good training, good education. They're coming back to their communities with like some form of citizenship that is recognized and valued by their communities. If anything, I think right now we're seeing a bit of a pedestal effect on military service, which, you know, as far as problems to have, I think we'll take that over our veterans being ignored and uncared for. But I think that can cause a bridge of understanding where, you know, we don't necessarily always think of the service member as being one of us within our communities. They're somehow other and set apart.
I'll just say, I think the GI Bill of 1944 is probably one of the most important pieces of legislation to impact the 20th century United States. I think the creation of the all-volunteer force in 1973 is one of the most impactful things in the history of this country since then, in the ways that it has redefined citizenship, in ways that it has redefined what the country's commitment to service and war can mean. And so I think that in the early years, you mentioned how high in esteem the military is now. That's from the nadir of the early 1970s, you know, that the all-volunteer force pulled those numbers up very, very high over time. But I do think it is, for all of us, it is something to really to think about very seriously about what we say as a country to be fighting in wars that are done by all volunteers in our name, and that and not in our name for declared wars as well. So even the House of Representatives does not declare war. The people don't declare war. So that, I find that to be, as a historian that may be teaching 30 years from now, I think I'll continue to go back to 1973 in that moment as something that was a tectonic shift in American public life, in American cultural life, and that we will continue to bear that weight for some time.
Yep. That's the last word.